All right, joining me now is Dr. Tim McAllister. He's with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, based out of Lethbridge. Hello, Tim.
Good morning, Lindsay.
All right. Okay, so we did see ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, came out with the fourth carbon offset protocol that they've put out there. And this one is on beef cattle methane reductions. And so this is a carbon offset protocol. Lots to go over. There is a consultation, but I wanted to back up a step and talk about some of the science and some of the things we know about what we can do to decrease methane emissions in cattle. And that is, of course, where you come in. So what have we learned about reducing methane emissions from cattle?
Well, we've probably the number one strategy that we have for lowering methane emissions in cattle is through the type of diet that we formulate for them. So generally speaking, when we look at our feedlots and where we're feeding higher grain diets, the amount of emissions per kilogram of meat produced is reduced substantially as a result of including cereal grains in the diet. Forages, the animals tend to also finish take a longer period of time to finish, and as a result, then the amount of emissions per kilogram of beef produced is typically higher.
So, and that could be in some ways counterintuitive for some if we think about, because at times we talk about the high intensity of feeding grain diets and forages are great for, our soil health and those sorts of things. But when we're talking specifically about methane emissions, we really have to think about the lifetime of that animal.
That's correct. That's correct. Because an animal that's been processed for meat doesn't produce any methane emissions
Not
after that
anymore.
point in time. That's
That's
right.
right. Yeah. All right. So now the draft protocol that's out there, it is up for consultation. It's up for comment until February, and so stakeholders, people can weigh in. At first glance, though, I know that there is mention of several different things we do, and so diets is a big one of them. Where might we see feed additives work their way into this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research going on at a global level in the relation to developing feed additives that can lower methane emissions. There's one compound that's commonly known as 3-NOP. It's, I believe, now going through a regulatory assessment in Canada, and we'll see what the outcome of that will be. But it could be available at some point in the future as well. And there's a number of other additives that are in the research pipeline as well that show potential for lowering methane emissions as well. Probably not quite as far along as 3-NOP is.
Right. So, and what kind of emissions reductions are we talking with something like 3-NOP?
The literature would suggest there's been many research studies that have been ran at various locations in the world, and probably the reduction is somewhere between 30 and 50%
Oh,
in
wow.
terms of the amount of methane that's reduced.
Okay. Now, let's maybe back up one step more. Genetically, are the cattle that we're finishing now more efficient as far as methane is concerned, um, than
Yeah,
say 30 years ago? What have we
yeah,
accomplished on the genetic side?
yeah. Well, we did do a study comparing from 1981 through to 2011 at that time, so over a 30-year period. And we found in that study that the carbon footprint associated with beef production was reduced about 15%. Now, that includes improvements within the animal. It also includes improvements within crop production and in yield. So it's really an all-encompassing approach in terms of the analysis that looks at all of the factors that contribute to emissions as a result of the production of beef.
Now, all right, so this is ECCC that has put this protocol together. That
That's
is the,
correct.
right, that's the department that is putting these together. We've seen forestry, methane from landfills, and refrigeration are the other protocols that are out there. The goal is that these are going to be government regulated carbon credit systems that could be traded. And so from the cattle producer's perspective, now you did consult on this draft protocol that's out there, but it is of course not Agriculture Canada's protocol that was put together,
That's correct. And
right?
ECCC did the consultation with more
Right.
than just with Agriculture Canada. It was across the country. Several stakeholder groups participated in that process.
So from the perspective of what producers, feedlot operators, who might actually participate in this, do you foresee it being relatively straightforward in that we have the science and we just need to, keep track of certain things? Or how do you foresee this actually all working out?
Well, I think like the keeping track of the record keeping will be part of that. Alberta had some protocols that were in place prior to it going nationally as well, and ECCC certainly looked at those protocols, and there's quite a few similarities between the Alberta protocol and what they've developed nationally as well. A lot of it is based on record keeping in that it's not realistic to really go out and make direct measurements at a feedlot or even in a open any kind of confinement situation, just because of the complexity in making those measurements, at least at this point in time, on such a broad scale. We can do it at a single feedlot, but to do for all the feedlots is just impractical. So it'll be mainly based on the modeling estimates and the other studies of which have been conducted under experimental situations that documented that variation in emission reduction that I mentioned, 30 to 50%, which will be used in the models and to estimate the reduction at each site that elects to employ those types of mitigation strategies.
Now, is there is there an overarching goal here? Because the cattle industry has already been working towards reducing emissions overall.
Definitely, yes.
Is there a driving goal from the cattle side, do you think, on where we could end up on the emission side?
Yeah, well, I think it's again increasing awareness, giving the opportunity. There may be emerging technologies that lower methane emissions that would be more advantageous for adoption if there's an incentive, an economic
Mm,
incentive that could come through carbon offsets types of programs. So that's one of the factors. There's other activities going on as well. Agriculture Canada has a global methane reduction challenge that is put out just recently. So, increasing awareness, making people aware that there are strategies to lower methane emissions emerging and encouraging their adoption is beneficial for the industry and beneficial in terms of addressing the issue of climate change at the same time.
hmm Now, we should make one thing clear, though, and this is one of the discussions that I think is important. So, in something like this draft protocol, we are talking about enteric emissions, right? So we're
That's
talking about,
correct.
right, when cattle burp, basically. What about sort of the manure side? Is that
Yeah, it's
negligible
included in
or
the
okay,
protocol.
it
No, it's
is.
also
Okay.
part of the protocol as well.
Okay.
So that a lot of that depends on how the manure is handled and
hmm
whether it's, how it's stored. And, there's also quite an emerging interest in terms of using manure and biodigestion and capturing that methane and using it for either heating or electrical generation as well.
hmm Now, those biodigesters exist in Canada
That's
already,
correct. Yeah.
but we typically see them in more of a system like a dairy system or something like that. So, what are some of the challenges of that kind of system in because this protocol is for beef cattle. So, what are some of the challenges in making something like that scaled to beef production?
Well, there's quite a significant capital investment in terms of the infrastructure that's required to produce those biodigesters and capture the methane. The manure also tends to be in more of a liquid state. If you've been around dairies, you know that there's more water used in washing of the barns and that as well. And so that's one of the difference with beef cattle manure. It tends to be more of a solid and typically composting or stockpiling or some of the manure management practices that are a little easier to implement than direct administration into the biodigesters. But that being said, there is biodigesters being developed. And then it's also, when you start to look at that, you need to also consider the yield of methane that's coming out of those biodigesters because that's going to impact the business model in terms of the investment that's gone into the biodigester and the amount of money that can be recovered through the sale of methane for either energy generation or heating or electrical generation.
hmm Now, um, the one question, and it's okay if you don't know the answer to this, but this is a regulated, a federally regulated market. So this is not open market carbon credit system. This is a regulated one, and that's why these protocols are being put in place. Do you get a sense of what the timeline might be between, these protocols coming out and when an operation might actually be able to sign paperwork and say, we've generated a credit and we're going to trade it?
Yeah, I think you'd probably be better off to ask ECCC that question because I don't really know what their timelines are for evaluation. Like it's under a 60-day open comment period right now, and I don't really have the information on their timelines in terms of when they're going to compile that information and move forward with actually actioning the program to make it available to the industry.
That is a very honest answer, and I thank you for that because I also don't know. But but as you mentioned, because we've been trying to figure that out. But as you mentioned, it is, I think it's February 6th is the deadline for anyone who wants to email their, and I believe they've asked for email, but you can send in your comments on what this might look like. Looking at it then, just to wrap up here, from the perspective of how much opportunity you see for the beef industry in something like this, um, do you foresee this being a really large opportunity or an opportunity for some? How much impact
Well,
do you think?
like I've always said that climate change and its complexity, that we need to really pull out all the stops and use every approach that we can use in agriculture to lower emissions from the agricultural sector, whether that be the livestock or the cropping sector. And I think that's in Canada's interest as well. Particularly, it's good for Canada. It's also good for consideration of the fact that we're an exporting nation in many of our agricultural goods, and that is becoming a criteria, in terms of the footprint associated with the production of those goods, is becoming a criteria that's increasing in terms of its importance for international trade. So it just makes sense for us to take whatever steps we can, introducing of these programs and incentives like the methane reduction challenge are positive in terms of increasing industry awareness, which I would say in Canada is already pretty high compared to many other beef producing countries in the world. But the more we can do to promote that and encourage those adoption practices, the better off we'll be. And with some of the emerging technologies that are coming up in the feed additive sector and that as well, those encouragements could also improve their adoption as well, and enable them to bring value to the industry as well.
All right. Lots to keep tabs on, so please keep us posted. But Dr. McAllister, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. Have a good day.